for that minor technical difficulty, but we're back. My name is James Williams, Director of Programs with the Mobile Ecosystem Forum. And there we've just had it, 6 sessions on IoT. So if you wanted to know what we get up to in the world of mobile IoT here at MEF, those half a dozen sessions give you a fantastic idea of what goes on with our members. So if you are into IoT, if you are a MEF member, please come and join that working group. And if you are interested in joining MEF, then you can contact me directly, James at mobileecosystemforum.com. It would be fantastic to have your company with us as part of the fast growing MEF community. So thanks to Nasia, thank you to all the speakers. We talked about connectivity being such a huge pivotal part of IoT, and within that, IoT would be practically nothing without the whole area of roaming. So I'm very pleased to introduce Steffen Sorrell, who is Chief of Research. Hello. Hey, Steffen, nice to have you with us. Hi.
Hi, James. How are you doing? Thanks for having me.
Good. No, so Steffen is Chief of Research with Kaleido Intelligence, and you're going to be looking at the whole area of IoT roaming, which ultimately underpins everything IoT. And without that, as I said, we wouldn't have IoT for the most part. So Steffen, take it away. I'll be back with you later. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Wait for my slide deck to come up. Oh, there we go. Okay, so yeah, thanks again, everyone. So today I'm going to be looking at the IoT roaming market. We've just updated our biannual data hub update. So this slide deck will incorporate the latest data that we have behind that. Just a quick introduction for those that don't know. Kaleido Intelligence is a specialist research house started around 4 years ago. We started looking at the roaming market as a whole, so from consumer, mobile, business, as well as IoT. And we also look at the connectivity system ecosystem now as a whole. So looking at things like eSIM, connectivity management platforms, eSIM subscription management, private networks, mobile security, and so on. As part of that research process, we take a very strong emphasis towards primary interaction with ecosystem players across the landscape. So just a quick slide here to illustrate some of those who have participated. And some of the information that you're going to see today is fresh off the back of a very large enterprise survey that we conducted earlier on in the year. So looking at perceptions with regards to IoT connectivity from around 760 enterprises. So possibly one of the broadest studies looking specifically into cellular IoT connectivities done to date. Anyway, let's get into how we see the IoT roaming market. So I think the first thing to address is what's happening in the broader cellular IoT market. So when we finalized our projections last year and updated them this year, really off the back of quite a lot of primary feedback that we've been receiving, is that there are some issues ongoing in the market today that have led us to slightly reduce the baseline installed base for cellular IoT. So if we look at what 2026 was last year versus this year, it's a 19% reduction in connections, somewhere around 4.6 billion connections in 2026, up to 5.2 in 2027. What are the reasons behind that? First of all, we still see ongoing pressures due to the chipset crisis. So when we talk to some of the hardware guys, we're understanding that priority is very much placed on higher margin chipsets. And in the context of IoT and also IoT roaming, that means that when you look at lead times, things like LPWAN, which are perhaps lower margin chips, then lead times are increased. Some players are also increasing prices for their hardware as well. So that's one of the areas where perhaps it's going to have some dampening factor. In other news, as you probably have read recently, China has recently announced a long-term zero COVID strategy. And as China is such a production powerhouse, this naturally has impacts on supply chain and availability of goods and resources and so on. Meanwhile, of course, we have the terrible conflict going on in the Ukraine, which as an offshoot to that is carrying with it economic headwinds, which will carry on into the foreseeable future. That's certainly an unknown at the moment. So what does that mean for IoT roaming? I mean, we're still going to see a substantial connection base of roaming IoT connections. So if we look at the back end of 2019, just over 200 million roaming IoT connections. That's going to increase to closing in on 1 billion IoT roaming connections by the end of the forecast period. So the big driver behind that are the so-called massive IoT connections. So technologies such as LTE-M and NB-IoT are expected to become a considerable force in that particular arena. And here, I mean, in terms of our data hub, we typically segment devices in terms of how much data they are consuming per month. So if we look at the permanent roaming IoT install base, so a lot of these connections are roaming for at least 90 consecutive days, if not longer, possibly years in their country of operation. So therefore, they're roaming on a permanent basis. And you can see there, a considerable uptick in terms of the proportion of those permanently roaming IoT connections that will be consuming less than 10 megabytes per month. So in that particular bracket, you can certainly count what I was talking about before, these LPWAN, NB-IoT, or LTE-M type connections. So clearly a very important driver for the future IoT roaming connection base. But I think what we have to talk about now, and what is being talked about a lot in the industry, is the issue of monetization. So historically, roaming has been based on transferred account procedures, settlements, which are effectively based or have been developed based on consumer voice, consumer messaging, consumer data traffic consumption. Now, when you look at those types of devices that roam, this traffic is very predictable. There's often quite a high consumption, especially now when you have all this video traffic crossing the network. But when you look at an LPWAN type connection, those devices might be phoning home once or twice a day, transmitting bytes or kilobytes of data at a time. And often these sort of accumulations of data, because tap records, I believe, are sent on a daily basis, don't actually exceed the thresholds to register a chargeable event. So you have a lot of these devices that are actually consuming very small amounts of data, not really being charged for them, and at the same time, still sending signaling data back and forth across the networks. They're still consuming network resources, but at the same time, they are not being monetized effectively in roaming scenarios. The impact of that is that when we look at the overall LPWAN landscape, roaming hasn't really taken off. One of those reasons is, of course, the cost to expand the necessary infrastructure. Another reason, of course, is the monetization. And that's why we see, a huge amount of, well, I wouldn't say huge, but considerable amount of NB-IoT devices out there, but most of them are operating domestically. At the same time, when you're not able to cater for those types of devices on an international scale, then you have problems on the supply, on the demand side. So while there is enterprise interest in LPWAN, the ecosystem is not fully ready to support that. And that's kind of a critical issue that's ongoing in IoT roaming right now. So when we look at what's happening again in monetization, I talked briefly about TAP. So the standard is not being developed. It's now frozen, so we don't expect to see any improvements in that particular standard moving forward. Meanwhile, it has a rigid settlement procedures. You also have things like not natively able to detect the radio access technology type being used by various devices. So that means you can't even segment, say, 5G traffic very easily to implement new charging models. Some things that are being talked about for LP1 are access-based type charging models rather than consumption-based models. Charging a device just for being active on the network, for example. But those are not really very easy to implement in TAP, often needs manual reconciliation, which again means additional costs and complexity for the two operators that are implementing that type of thing. So what we have coming in now is billing and charging evolution, so BCE, which is a new settlement standard for the wholesale market. It's under active development. It's not rigid in the sense that you can, for example, establish any settlement type window for sending files over. The standard is capable of differentiating between different radio access types, and you're able at the same time to implement new types of business models, such as those non-consumption type models. And we're certainly already seeing some level of that, whether that's BCE or via manual processes, where certainly across some of the IoT MVNO landscape, some of these MVNOs are now saying they're seeing some charges per month for devices simply being operating on the network. Okay. So another thing, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, is our enterprise survey that we conducted into IoT roaming. So we directly asked enterprises what they saw as their main challenges in regards to cellular IoT connectivity. And I think there are three particular results that stand out here in the context of IoT roaming. So the first of all, we have just over 55% of respondents stating that for them to be successful, the management and relationships of a number of different connectivity providers to support international operations is a key challenge. So some of you might be saying, okay, why don't they just go with a large global provider and they can have roaming anywhere in the world and they have a single touch point there? But that's not really possible on a global scale right now. Even tier 1 MNOs don't have full coverage, or at least coverage where those costs meet an enterprise's criteria. So in that sense, you have a lot of enterprises who then need to engage with different providers across the globe to source their connectivity locally. It's a massive headache in terms of their backend integrations, different processes, support, everything. It's a continuing issue in the landscape today. I touched upon this just now. The second highest result there is robust global coverage is lacking. That's one of the things that's still ongoing in terms of the LP-WAN landscape. Even when you do have a narrowband or LTE-M network in place, it's often just one provider across the country, and it may be really focused on particular cities rather than true nationwide coverage. That is still ongoing and must be built out. And of course, we have the what I talked about just now in terms of the overall footprint of various providers. And I think this is one of the reasons why we're starting to see quite strong growth among IoT MVNO types who are aggregators of connectivity footprints around the world, whether that's through roaming agreements, whether that's through multi-IMSI approaches, sponsored roaming, or even via eSIM, where we're seeing some MNOs certainly adopting a more wholesale approach and willingness to supply their profiles for that. And of course, we can't talk about IoT roaming without mentioning permanent roaming. And just over 45% of respondents raising concerns over how countries are increasing restrictions related to permanent roaming. So whether that's on a regulatory basis, for example, in Brazil or Turkey, or whether it's on a commercial basis, for example, in the US or Australia. What you have in either case is a situation where it's very difficult, if not impossible, to scale up operations using permanent roaming. Of course, on the commercial level, you can arrange agreements, interoperator agreements for permanent roaming. But the challenge, again, of course, is how long are those agreements and how long are my devices going to be in the field? If you look at a smart meter, for example, it's 15 years plus. Are roaming agreements that long? No. So there is an element of risk no matter what. So there certainly needs to be a move towards an overall flexibility where roaming plays a big part, but there are other guarantees that allow customers to ensure that they will always have device availability. Next question we asked enterprises was, what are the top factors they look for in an IoT connectivity partner's product? You can see all these different percentages there. These percentages represent the strength of that response in that particular rank. Just to clarify that. But if we have a look at those three results, key to enterprises and second highest rank is permanent roaming for the reasons I've talked about just now. You need to have that long-term risk mitigation, whether that's through commercial agreements or technical solutions. We see again in terms of rank 3, must have robust coverage as well as support for multi-regional, multi-country deployments. Too often we see that while roaming is supported in various markets, the level of support drops in particular instances because if there's a problem with a device, then the enterprise goes to its connectivity partner. The connectivity partner then has to go to its roaming partner. There may be a lower priority for the VP MLN. So, looking at protracted support times and a lack of visibility in the industry there, which can hamper support activities. Finally, there are, in terms of rank 4, single pane of glass is something that we've been hearing a lot about since 2020 and a dramatic rise in IoT since COVID. Enterprises want that single pane of glass, that single touch point to manage and monitor their entire fleet, no matter where these devices are operating. And of course, they would prefer it if their connectivity partners across the globe were integrated at a level that they could achieve that single pane of glass management. Obviously, that is a significant challenge, but certainly an enterprise desire to minimize that complexity so that they, on their level, can reduce their own costs and management time required for these types of devices. Of course, eSIM or XUICC, so eSIM or iSIM, is a very important thing to look at in terms of what does it mean for IoT roaming. We certainly have a positive outlook on the number of eSIM devices that will be out there in the field. So over 2.4 billion either eSIM or iSIM supported devices will be in the field by 2027. But the question is really, how does that impact roaming? I mean, the current status quo is that eSIM is, for the vast majority of cases, used in insurance mode, where the actual profile itself will most likely be a global roaming profile, and the device will be roaming. And there's very little localization or optimization actually taking place because of the current state of affairs with the M2M specification for eSIM. Meanwhile, we also have this new development in terms of integrated SIM, which means the SIM is entirely embedded into the system on chip, but follows the same remote SIM provisioning framework as eSIM. That's a very important development particularly for constrained devices, because you get power use reduction, you get extra space, and often you can, that fully integrated development process can be advantageous depending on which type of connectivity provider you're working with. But of course, iSIM still follows the same remote SIM provisioning roadmap as eSIM. So there are important developments going on in the standards landscape right now. So the GSMA is due to publish its IoT specification by the end of this year, which will, first of all, simplify the overall architecture. It means that the legal, commercial, and business process complexity involved with switching from one eSIM platform provider to another that's ongoing right now, that type of complexity will be reduced to a significant extent. What that means in terms of overall use of eSIM, whether that now becomes a tool to optimize at a much larger scale, is still under question. You still have those transaction costs involved with switching or downloading network profiles. So certainly something to consider there. Meanwhile, we have, what's the question of what is the approach for these types of devices? Should I go EUICC only? Should I combine multi-IMSI with EUICC? So traditionally, we see MNOs going EUICC, or should I say XUICC only. We see IoT MVNOs often employing a multi-IMSI plus XUICC approach. Essentially, the latter is certainly more flexible in terms of how it's able to extend that coverage footprint. And it's important to mention here that, again, in the vast majority of cases, those devices are still roaming. So I think for the foreseeable future, eSIM is not going to destroy roaming. We still have a high level of uncertainty ongoing in the ecosystem. So I'm just going to quickly finish off my presentation with a playfully titled slide named Strategies to Master IoT Roaming. And it's related to some of the trends that we're looking at right now. And certainly off the back of this enterprise survey that we completed, it's become quite evident that connectivity alone is not enough. First of all, we see a lot of demand on enterprise side for things like cloud connectors, cloud services for analytics. It's also quite a high level of demand for security services. I don't know if you saw, but in one of the earlier slides, we saw that end-to-end security was the #1 requirement for IoT connectivity. So, if you're able to provide value-added services in different types of directions there, that will be highly valuable to the enterprise. Additionally, we're also seeing, when you look at a Vodafone, for example, they have a strong business intelligence offering that is able to just take the data that's inside the CMP and add value to that in various ways to help the enterprise optimize its fleet and operations and so on. Secondly, eSIM, iSIM, it is coming, so it must be supported. The change to this type of new SIM form factor and architecture is inevitable. Whether that is simply for an insurance mode type approach, or whether you want to facilitate that highly flexible aggregator approach that we're seeing in some sides of the market right now. To have just a UICC right now is something that will not be appealing to enterprises in the future. And this is reflected again in the survey, where we saw very high interest in eSIM, or even adoption as part of at least a small part of their fleets. I talked about a little bit about this earlier, but roaming support needs are critical. To have that device uptime is naturally critical to the vast majority of IoT applications. So therefore, you need a very high level of support, whether that's tools that are implemented, first of all, in the CMP itself, or whether you have facilitated integrations with roaming partners, core networks, RAN, to make sure that that signaling data, the control plane data, and other useful information is visible for your engineers, or whether perhaps your customer is highly advanced and wants that type of information, so the diagnosis of the problem can be identified quickly and resolved quickly. We need to see some more activity on that side of the market to create a high quality roaming experience. And of course, their customers desperately want reduced complexity. We saw that time and time again in the survey, whether that's hardware, for example. We see very few providers offering hardware expertise to enterprises to go out there and deploy IoT. That coverage, the single pane of glass issue, and the ability to apply a flexible model to various elements of international device support is something that still needs to be addressed at some level to help smooth that journey for enterprise customers. So that was on the outbound side. What about the inbound side of roaming? So I think COVID was very revealing. Consumer traffic disappeared, but a lot of operators are saying, oh, hang on, there's still loads of devices, there's still loads of traffic roaming. Evidently, that was IoT roaming. I think one of the major strategies right now has to be in terms of analytics to help identify those devices, which in turn can help monetize those devices. Certainly seems to be a lack of that going in the industry right now at some level. But I suspect that attitude is changing. We've done a couple of surveys this year and last year, where analytics was a key priority. Meanwhile, when we talk about LP1, we can't not talk about eDRX or PSM, so these power-saving modes to enable that 10-year battery life. Without it, battery life is fairly terrible. But we don't really see them in roaming IR21 agreements. That needs to be changed because the value in those types of IoT devices is their longevity as well as the data. Of course, that monetization has to be solved. So the current charging model is unsustainable. I would suggest that the industry needs to move quickly towards BSE, towards the BCE standard, or at least find some way of charging, perhaps on an IMSI basis, for those very low traffic type devices, because you must be able to recuperate those costs. And finally, just to close it out, coverage, I talked about that. It's a key enterprise requirement. I think all over we need to see how that's addressed, whether that's on an LP1 level, whether that's through additional partnerships or integrations into roaming hubs to expand that coverage, or whether that's alternative strategies to be able to facilitate that coverage, such as through eSIM, for example. A big requirement across the landscape right now. So I did have a slide for questions, but I believe I've run out of time. Back over to you, James. I think you're on mute.
So yes, you have. I've got multiple questions myself, but we don't have the time. But one thing from all time in the industry, from what you've been seeing the past year in particular, rated 1 to 10, 1 is not at all, 10 is everyone's doing it. How would you say mobile network operators are doing at really switching on to understanding, hey, there's a real top opportunity for us if we get into IoT big style, in plain language?
I'd say maybe a 4 or 5.
Okay, so plenty of homework to be done.
I think you have your very big MNOs out there. You've got your Vodafone, your DT, Telefonica, AT&T, and so on. So the tier ones have a relatively good grip on it. I think there's an opportunity on the tier 2, tier 3 side of things, particularly where you look at services such as telco as a service or network as a service to help them expand those operations. And also, there is money to be made at the wholesale level in terms of whether it's multi-IMSI, eSIM, and so on. We're seeing an improvement overall.
Fantastic. Hold that thought on wholesale. We have a September session about IoT as part of our wholesale events, which starts on September the 14th, the next MEF event. But that's it for now. Steffen, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your colleague John and his panel coming up now. Thank you.
Thanks, James.